David Eastwood is the director of HDR at UNSW Art and Design. He's a drawer himself, and his practice is a little bit more traditionally understood as a drawing skill set. So I think he's a good way to understand the concept of this exhibition that uses drawing terminology and looks at the expanded potential of digital fabrication. For David's practice, it can be very easily understood through traditional skill sets of charcoal drawing, but it's also brought into a contemporary context. And his works largely look at models. These are plaster teaching tools that he's based this off, and it's a disembodied self-portrait of himself. So David, how about you talk a little bit about your practice, namely what drawing techniques you use and what digital techniques you also incorporate?
Okay, so I might start with the digital techniques because that's the beginning of the process for these. So both of these works are based on 3D scans, just using a mini iPad with a 3D scanner that I borrowed from the University of New South Wales. And like this one, for instance, is just my own foot leaning on a block of styrofoam, and I just got a friend to scan it because it's hard to keep your own foot still while you're scanning yourself. And then the other work is we kind of swapped where I was scanning my friend's arm, propped up on a cardboard tube to keep it still and sitting on a styrofoam block. So through that 3D scanning process, I ended up with these two 3D model digital files, which could be used to make a 3D print or do any number of digital post-production processes. What I did was position them on the screen, choose the lighting, and also work with a particular texture which gave these body parts a very unflesh-like kind of texture, made them look kind of shiny. Some people think they look slimy. I thought they sort of looked like porcelain, but the point is they're neither slimy nor porcelain because they don't have a physical materiality. They only exist as digital images. And so then I take their digital presence and give them a physical presence through the use of charcoal on paper. So these are rendered in charcoal. I mainly use charcoal powder with a paintbrush and build up layers and just carefully mask sections to get that sharpness and precision.
And this was part of a solo show originally, probably the first time you'd publicly shown self-portraits, called False Monuments. So I was just wondering about the term false monuments in your practice and how that comes in, because obviously there's allusion to classical drawing tools that you would use in education and being an educator yourself, but there's also, I guess, a larger aspect of this idea of falseness that you explore in your practice.
Yeah, I think of them as there's historical references in the work in that they recall fragments of sculpture from classical antiquity, but they're not that, they're fabricated, they're just kind of made in a very basic way in my own studio. So in that sense there's a falseness, and I wanted to call attention to them as constructed or fabricated in the sense that they're a fiction. They're imagined versions of sculptures which don't exist, and the bases and the cardboard tube that's propping up the arm, they reference the kinds of support structures that you might see in museum displays, but they also, in some ways,
there's a DIY-ness to them as well.
Yeah, and even the way that cardboard tube presses into the flesh of the arm the display mechanism interacts with the sculpture in a way that you wouldn't normally see in, if it was like a fragment of a sculpture displayed in a museum, there's elements of it which are in a slight way kind of exposing the fakeness of them.
Yeah, and why, as a self-portrait, you're self-disembodied, and if you look at the larger False Monuments works, why is disembodiment a core theme that you use to discuss this aspect of self-portraiture?
I mean, the process, by thinking of them as monuments, on the one hand, there's this kind of ridiculous self-aggrandizement, but on the other hand, they're also self-deprecating, so sort of the breaking down of the figure.
It's a bit of a sense of humour in the piece as well, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm reluctant to do that to other people. Like I don't want to objectify other people's body parts, and so I've mainly done myself, and it took me a while before I asked a friend to do it. And I was thinking of...
Were you thinking of a friend with a particularly nice, like a hand model or something?
No, it was more looking at the idea of museum specimens in museums where I'd seen, say, Chopin's hand cast as this sort of fetishization of the creative genius. So I asked another artist to pose with her hand, and so on the one hand, I feel a bit conflicted. Like when I'm doing it to my own body parts, I'm thinking I'm sparing other people of having their bodies scanned and objectified, but then I also feel like, is this a weird kind of self-aggrandizement? So then. So then I feel like, well, maybe I will subject other people to it, but I'm still thinking that through.
And I guess the other aspect to that particular series was it was this barren, empty room, which is your studio, and you'd taken all the objects out of the room and left it empty. But your works always look at the afterlife of a studio and have this untied model making and such, so I was just curious a little bit more as to how's that an extension of your PhD process in the afterlife of studios?
So the first thing I did after I did a PhD on posthumously preserved artist studios or reconstructed artist studios, and the first thing I did after I finished that PhD was to look at my own studio. I made a digital model of it and just stripped it out, looked at the studio as an empty shell, kind of erasing my own presence from the space. And I came into the 3D scanning process as a way of populating that studio with objects. That was the intention, but I never ended up doing that because I just became interested in the 3D models themselves and ended up mainly just putting them in nondescript spaces and treating them as still life objects, because I just found them intrinsically interesting as this conflict between the subject of the body and flesh, heavily mediated through digital processes and then returned to an analog medium, but somehow they're transformed through that process. And it connects back to the kinds of things I was looking at in artist studios, where you would see sculptural objects that were drawing aids to study from, anatomical studies and that kind of thing. So there was a kind of logic in terms of the lineage of that project, but removed.
And one of your core artists was Francis Bacon, but were there any other artists that you focused on? How are other artist studios different from one another?
Artist studios that get preserved tend to be preserved when, I guess, the artist has a certain level of fame or prominence, obviously, but also when there's something kind of pronounced about the
disarray or organization.
yeah, the way, yeah, that's right, the design of the space, if I can use that word. I mean, Francis Bacon's studio was full of detritus and mess, and that in itself, you know, there was so much material that people found fascinating, and so that has been
Especially the way it
recreated.
destroys some paintings and stuff. Like, there would be all these like weird remnants of like potentially other existing works and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think for similar reasons, that's why Margaret Olley's home and studio have been preserved in Australia, because there's just so much stuff there. And I guess, Morandi's studio, his still life objects in his bedroom, you know, it's like his whole world was contained in his bedroom studio. So it becomes this fascinating specimen that's an extension of the artist's life and work. So it's kind of biographical but it's a weird phenomenon that and related to the preservation of writers' houses and I think of it as a subgenre of the period room, but with a very specific biographical connection between an artist's work and their life, and
The spectral presence that's
and it becomes a monument itself to the artist. So it's a challenging thing to work with as a subject, because you don't want to just make work that pays homage and perpetuates myths of the artist's genius and the very sort of gendered history around the male artist genius. So I was approaching these artists' studios as a way to think about the non-human or the more than human elements, and what a new artist can do coming along to these spaces and kind of collaborating with the materiality of the studio in the absence of the original inhabitant. So anyway, but that goes back to my PhD.
That's all right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, David, and we'll go on to the next person.